Thanks. So I'm a software developer. I don't know if you know me. I'm Jeremy Brooks. I work with React quite a lot, and in our team we like to give each other some L&D time, some learning and development time. And one of the things I decided to look at was React hooks, and I thought, well, I may as well share it. What I'm learning. So this is a kind of a brief summary and introduction, really, not too deep. And these two laptops have to work well on this display, which hasn't been happening, so it's going to go interesting. So React, I don't know if everyone knows what React is. It's a JavaScript framework. It's component-based, and it favors composition over inheritance, which just means that you compose components of components. And I'm not going to go too deep into it. It's just kind of a rough intro of React, very rough. So why did React come up with hooks? Essentially to make life a little bit easier and simpler for developers who use React. And it's kind of a conscious shift away from classes, although they're not deprecating classes. They are kind of shifting that way because I think what you read online seems to suggest that they think that's the thing at the moment that's making things more current, frameworks more current. And also we have functional components that you write in React, and you can't do things that you can do with class components. This gives you that, so you can access things like state, lifecycle, and lots of other things, which I'll get into. There's also some potential performance improvements. I said potential because they're not always performance improvements. It depends how you write your code. I'm also not going to go too deep into that either, because that's a whole other topic. So straight into a use of a hook. It's a built-in hook, and it's called UseState, and it's something you can now pull into your functional component, and you can use it like you would a React class component to get access to state. Slightly different syntax than what you might be used to. So some of you might have been used to set state, for example, when you set a state value. When you use UseState, you pull in the UseState function, and it takes an initial count, for example, in this case. So over here, I haven't got a pointer, sorry. We've got the state variable, it's count, and the setter is setCount. And this is a pattern that they use with UseState, so it will always return a value and a setter. That's pretty much it. Down here you've got usage of it, so on click it sets the count to count plus 1. So the initial count is 0, adds 1, and so on. That's nice and simple. There is more to it, but as I say, this is just an overview, and this is one of the first things that people tend to do because accessing state in functional components wasn't possible until hooks were introduced. Another one, UseEffect. So with class components, you're probably aware that you have life cycle if you use React much, which means that when a component is rendered, you have certain events that happen. So you might have, for example, some properties that you inject into your component, and when they change at a certain point in the life cycle, the component will re-render, and it will use those new property values. UseEffect is a kind of encompassing all method function. So this is a nice simple example where you pull in UseState just like you did UseEffect, just like you did with UseState. We've got both examples together, so I wanted to combine them to show you that usage as well. UseEffect, it's around here. So it just updates the document title with the latest count. And that will happen every time you update the count. So every time setter on count is called, setCount, this will get called and it will update the title to the new count. So that's kind of your equivalent to updating state, and component did update that part of the lifecycle. There's a lot more lifecycle events that are covered in this, but this is just a surface, so I'm not going to go into those either because I've only got 10 minutes. So slightly more complex. They say that you should, or they suggest that it might be useful to extract more complex state manipulation or setting of state into a reducer. So if you're familiar with things like Redux, then you might know this pattern where your reducer takes in a state and action, and whatever the action type is, it does something. So in this case, this will just say, okay, am I incrementing or decrementing? Then it will add or -1, and if it doesn't get anything, then it just returns the state as it is. And how you use this, use another inbuilt hook called UseReduce at the top, imported, and it's fairly simple. UseReduce takes your reducer, so it will execute your code in your reducer to work out what the state should be, depending on what it gets from the action and your initial state as before. Initial state will just be 0 as before. This time slightly more complex because I've used an object as the initial state, so count 0, but similar. And then down here we call dispatch. This is something that's returned from UseReducer. Another thing that they've pulled from Redux as a pattern. It isn't Redux, it's built in, but it's just a pattern that they've chosen because we're very familiar with it. So you get your dispatch. You call dispatch with an action. That's what this object actually is. I probably should have extracted that out to make it a little bit more clear. But anyway, you give it a type, and you can see that the type relates to the action in the previous slide. So, the action type. So that's where it all hangs together, and it will return the new value. And it will be very similar to the previous one that used state and UseEffect. Okay. So the cool thing is you can also create your own hooks, and those hooks have to follow some simple rules that React have strongly suggested, because you'll get lots of warnings and errors if you don't stick to them. So for example, you need to have use at the start of your hook name. Your function name has to start with use. It can only be called from a component as well, or within another hook, and it mustn't be conditional. So React wants to maintain a predictable way of calling each hook, and the only way for it to do that is for you not to put it in a conditional block and to be at the top level of your component. That's it, I think. Yep. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast. Okay, so a really simple use case for a custom component, a custom hook, would be if you have the same logic in a couple of places. So this is really, I mean, it's all pseudocode, but if you had some members and you had some logic that set the members, and you also had the same code in this component, and you did exactly the same thing, but you just rendered them slightly differently. Really simple example, you probably wouldn't do that, but if you did, then you can use that logic in your own hook. Now, this is where I'm going to attempt, but I'll have to just use the stuff out of React. The color's not brilliant, but anyway. So this is kind of straight out of React, examples using hooks and writing your own hook. So this is, all this has done is, so the example had this logic in two components. And it said, okay, let's identify and extract the common logic and put it into a function, aka a hook with the name use at the front of the function name. And you can see it also pulls in UseState and UseEffect. So it's quite powerful because you can use other hooks in your custom hooks. So here, you've got UseEffect, which subscribes or unsubscribes, I'll come back to this, subscribes to, in this case, a friend status service of some sort, and uses the handle state change, and on that it changes the status to online or offline, depending on whatever it is. This bit at the bottom here is quite cool. So if you're familiar with React components, class components, and you've got a lifecycle method called component will unmount, I think it is. Basically, this is your cleanup code. So you can provide UseEffect with a return a function from UseEffect, and what that will do, it will say, okay, I'm returning you're returning a function, therefore this is your cleanup logic. So that's all that's doing. It's just unsubscribing in this case. And the UseState is in there, similar to the example that I showed you before, just sets is online here. That's it really. And its usage, you could probably guess. So this is one example where you just imported, import's hidden, but you imported use friend status. These imagine are in separate files, they're separate components, functional components. They're both pulled in the same hook, and it's significantly shortened the code because that logic before was inside the component, whoops, that was inside each component, whereas now you've just got one call to get, to use that hook that you wrote. You provide it an ID, it goes off and subscribes to an ID and gets back if it's online or offline, and then does some things slightly differently depending on the function. Displays online, offline, or colors it green or black. I mean, it's a simple example, but it just shows you that you can use your own hooks and use other hooks inside them, which is the main thing really I want to get across. That's frustrating, I missed the code bit. Yeah, so how long have I had? So I'm nearly done. So there's some future topics I was going to look at because there's too much going on. But global state is quite interesting. So you can use context with hooks to provide global state. You don't need to use Redux or other libraries, although Redux does integrate quite well with hooks. And some edge case built-in hooks, which I haven't talked about. There's quite a few. Things like synchronous life cycle logic. And what else is there? I'll come back to that in a different talk. Unit testing hooks was interesting. So you can't just call a hook in your test without either mocking another hook that you use in your test or providing a component to wrap it in. Because if you remember the rules before, you have to either call a hook within a component or you can call a hook in a hook. So it's slightly harder to unit test, but so if you're familiar with mocking, then you're okay. But I'll go into that another time, I think. And that's it, super fast.